At exactly 11:59 p.m. GMT, the message was transmitted encrypted, direct, and brutal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had delivered a 72-hour ultimatum to the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Not through diplomats. Not through handshakes. But through a lightning strike of intelligence that shook every intelligence corridor from Tel Aviv to Washington. It was not a request. It was a declaration. A line had been crossed, and Traoré had drawn a new one with fire. He accused Israel of waging invisible wars on African soil, of destabilizing the Sahel under the disguise of intelligence gathering. No evidence was presented publicly, but that was the point. Traoré wasn't talking to the UN. He was talking to power, and he knew power only respects direct confrontation. The world had seen African leaders beg. Traoré issued a threat. The deadline wasn't just a countdown, it was a psychological weapon. It paralyzed Western embassies. It sent Mossad chiefs into late-night emergency meetings. It wasn't the words that terrified them. It was the tone. Cold. Calculated. Controlled. Not the voice of a desperate leader, but of a man certain of what he held in reserve. Inside the Burkinabe military headquarters, an entire digital war room had been activated. All movements of foreign operatives in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Ghana were under surveillance. The networks had been mapped. Phones tapped. Bank transfers traced. What was once invisible was now in the crosshairs. Netanyahu had received warnings before from Iran, from Turkey, from Hezbollah. But never from a captain in West Africa. Never from a man wearing jungle fatigues, younger than half the Israeli cabinet, leading one of the poorest nations on earth. And that's why the threat hit harder than any missile. Because it wasn't expected. It wasn't supposed to happen. Traoré's ultimatum was not just military. It was symbolic. It shattered the myth that small nations must bow to global intelligence giants. It reminded the world that sovereignty isn't granted, it's taken. His message said, Africa will no longer be your playground. And this time, we're not asking. The Israeli Security Council underestimated him. They thought the deadline was political theater. But in the Sahel, politics is war in disguise. Traoré wasn't bluffing. The ultimatum was backed by real-time satellite intel, by ground operatives, by regional alliances that had been quietly forming for months, coordinated not with Twitter hashtags, but with encrypted war codes. Traoré didn't wait for the media. He didn't issue statements to a CNN or Al Jazeera. He sent his warning through dark channels because he wasn't looking for applause. He was preparing a trap. A psychological game of speed, silence, and shock. And Netanyahu walked right into it. Within hours of the message, chatter began in Israeli intelligence forums. Who is backing Traoré? Who gave him the tech, the logistics, the nerve? No answers. Just fear, because when an enemy acts with complete certainty, it means they've already moved pieces you haven't seen. And Traoré had moved them all. The deadline spread like wildfire across private security channels. The French, who once called the shots in Burkina Faso, were suddenly spectators. The Americans couldn't decipher what was real and what was bluff. Even the African Union stayed silent, caught between admiration and terror. Traoré wasn't asking for help. He was setting the rules. Alone. Netanyahu's team believed they could wait it out. They assumed the threat was a tactic to gain attention. But the countdown was ticking, and nothing was being de-escalated. In fact, everything was escalating silently. Israeli assets in Ouagadougou started losing contact with handlers. Signals jammed. Safe houses compromised. Flight routes rerouted. Behind closed doors, Netanyahu called for assessments. Every analyst said the same: this is different. Traoré isn't threatening, he is inviting confrontation. And yet, Israel did nothing. Because doing something meant acknowledging the threat. And acknowledging it meant losing face to a country the West still calls developing. But Traoré knew the psychological architecture of empires. He knew silence could be louder than missiles. He knew that issuing a 72-hour ultimatum, precise, public, without flinching, would force his enemies to guess, to doubt, to panic. While they hesitated, he mobilized. Drone units were deployed across the northern territories. Special forces trained by former Wagner operatives were put on alert. The borders were locked down not against refugees, but against spies. Telecommunications were scanned for digital interference. Even private security firms in the region began to quietly pull out, sensing the storm was real. No African leader had ever called out Israel directly, not like this. Not with the clock ticking. Not with names and locations already known. The deadline was not just military, it was existential. Traoré was telling the world, Africa remembers. And Africa retaliates. This was not about religion. Not about diplomacy. It was about decades of unseen operations: mineral manipulation, false flag rebellions, silent assassinations, and puppet regimes. Traoré wasn't speaking just for Burkina Faso. He was the mouthpiece of unspoken African fury. He was saying what presidents feared to whisper. And he said it with a deadline. To the outside world, it seemed suicidal. Why provoke Israel? Why challenge one of the most feared intelligence machines on earth? But Traoré had calculated that fear was Israel's greatest weapon, and exposing that fear was his only way to win. So, with the clock ticking, he made no second statement. No clarifications. No backtracking. Just silence. Strategic silence. The kind of silence that screams in war rooms and rattles generals. Because silence means preparation. Silence means certainty. Silence means, impact is coming. Netanyahu's aides urged him to respond publicly, to flex, to dismiss. But Netanyahu had faced Hamas, Iran, Hezbollah. None had ever sent him a deadline from West Africa. This was unfamiliar terrain. It felt different. Because it was different. For 3 days, the region waited. Not just for Israel's reply, but for Traoré's next move. And that was the genius of the deadline. It wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. It forced everyone to look at what they had ignored, that Africa was awakening, not just economically but militarily, strategically, and unapologetically. And at the center of that awakening stood one man, in a captain's uniform, holding a ticking clock, and daring a nuclear-armed nation to cross him. Because he knew, time was not on Netanyahu's side. The next move would change everything.